Picture two men standing in the rain. The first is holding a bucket. Wide, generous, built to catch a flood. But look closer. It's riddled with holes. The rain pours in, and just as fast, pours back out. The second man holds something smaller, a cup, steel, without a single crack. He catches far less rain than the first man, but he keeps every drop. By the time the storm passes, the man with the enormous bucket has nothing to show for it. The man with the small cup has filled a barrel. This isn't a story about rain. It's the story of why some people earn a fortune and stay poor, while others earn almost nothing, and quietly, without anyone noticing, become wealthy. And it begins with a man named Hiroshi. For 19 years, Hiroshi worked the same job. Not glamorous, not particularly well paid. Factory floor, then line supervisor. The kind of steady, modest salary that covers rent, groceries, and little else. Every month looked the same. The paycheck arrived. The bills arrived faster. By the third week, Hiroshi was doing the quiet math everyone in his position learns to do. What can be cut, just to make it to the next payday. He wasn't careless with money. He didn't gamble. He didn't chase things he couldn't afford. By every measure he knew, he was responsible. And yet, after 19 years of responsible living, his savings held less than 2 months of expenses. He used to believe the problem was the number on his paycheck, that if the company paid him 20% more, everything would finally work. But here's what most people in Hiroshi's position never get to test. They never actually receive the raise. So the theory never gets the chance to be wrong. It was, of all things, a mandatory training session that changed the direction of his life. Not a seminar on productivity, not a motivational speaker. A quiet woman near retirement age, standing at the front of a fluorescent-lit room, holding nothing but an ordinary notebook. She didn't sell an app. She didn't promise a system. She simply said, "You don't have a money problem, you have an attention problem, and attention can be trained with a pencil." Hiroshi almost laughed. It sounded too simple to matter. But he wrote down the word she used for her method. A word that, translated plainly, means household ledger. A method already over 100 years old by the time it reached him. He had no idea it was about to change everything he thought he understood about being poor and about being rich. Here's the part most people get wrong about money. They assume the problem is math, income minus expenses, a simple equation, badly balanced. But neuroscience tells a different story. Every time you spend, your brain registers something researchers call the pain of paying, a small, almost invisible flicker of discomfort. Cash creates that discomfort. You feel the bills leaving your hand. But a tap, a confirmation beep, a subscription on autopay? The pain nearly disappears, and when the pain disappears, so does your awareness. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How much of your own life have you already stopped noticing? This is why Hiroshi, a careful, disciplined man, still couldn't explain where his money went each month. He wasn't undisciplined. He was numb. Ask anyone to overhaul their financial life overnight, and within 2 weeks, most people quit. Not from weakness, from what feels, to the brain, like an attack. Sudden change reads as threat, and the mind fights back the only way it knows how, by quietly sabotaging the plan. So what if the fix wasn't more discipline at all? What if it was something almost embarrassingly small? The woman in the training room hadn't asked Hiroshi to change his life. She'd asked him to do one thing every single day. Write it down. Not categorize, not analyze, Just notice. Because the moment you write an expense down by hand, you bring the pain of paying back, on your own terms, without losing a single yen. That's the entire secret hiding inside a 100-year-old notebook. Not restriction. Awareness restored. Hiroshi didn't believe it would work. Not really. He bought the notebook mostly out of politeness. The kind of thing you do after a mandatory seminar, meaning to try it for a week and quietly abandon it by the second. He had no way of knowing that the version of himself, who almost didn't bother, would 1 year later look back on that evening as the one that changed everything. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, there were 3 small things he had to do. 3 habits so minor they barely felt like habits at all. And for a while, they would feel like they were doing nothing. The first pillar was almost insultingly small: reduce spending by 1%. Not a dramatic budget cut that collapses by February, the way resolutions usually do. 1%. Small enough that Hiroshi barely noticed it. A slightly cheaper lunch. 1 fewer impulse by a month. Your brain doesn't sound the alarm over 1%. That's exactly the point. It's too small a change to fight. The second pillar reversed something Hiroshi had done his entire adult life without ever questioning it. Increase savings by 1%, but move it first, before the paycheck ever touched his checking account. Not what was left over at the end of the month. Because for 19 years, nothing had ever been left over. There was always some final bill, some small emergency, some reason the number came out to 0. Save first. Live on the rest. It sounds like a small reversal. It isn't. It's the difference between a plan and a hope. But money, it turned out, was never the actual target of this experiment. The third pillar had nothing to do with money at all. Invest 1 hour a week in a skill, not a course, not a certificate. 1 hour spent learning something that made Hiroshi slightly more valuable, at his job or somewhere far from it. Compounding, he would come to understand, was never just a financial idea. It was for him. For the version of himself who existed 1 hour, 1 week at a time. 3 pillars, all of them small enough to ignore completely. And for the first 6 weeks, Hiroshi did exactly that, in a sense. He followed them, but he felt nothing. No relief, no breakthrough. No moment where the fog lifted and the math suddenly made sense. Just a notebook, filling slowly with numbers that didn't yet mean anything. He almost stopped there. 6 weeks is exactly the point where most people close the notebook for the last time and call the experiment a failure. Not because it failed, but because nothing has happened yet. And nothing happening feels indistinguishable from nothing working. Hiroshi didn't know the difference yet either. He just kept writing, mostly out of stubbornness, the way you keep planting seeds in soil that hasn't shown you a single sign of green. What he didn't understand, what almost no one understands from the inside of week 6, is that some changes don't announce themselves gradually. They stay invisible for a long, long time. And then, all at once, they aren't. There's an old story about a king who wanted to reward a clever servant. The servant asked for something that sounded almost insulting in its modesty. 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, 2 on the second. Double it, every square, 64 times. The king laughed and agreed instantly. It seemed like nothing. By square 20, it was a modest pile. By square 40, it was a mountain he couldn't have imagined agreeing to. By square 64, it was more rice than existed in his entire kingdom. 1% compounding behaves the same way. Invisible at first, undeniable eventually. The tragedy is that almost everyone quits during the invisible part. This is where most people quit. Month 2, month 3. The bucket still looks the same size. The changes feel too small to have mattered at all. There were nights Hiroshi wanted to quit too. Nights the notebook felt less like a practice and more like a chore he was performing for no one. A private ritual with no audience and, as far as he could tell, no results. He kept writing anyway, not because he'd already seen proof it was working, because somewhere in those 6 weeks, the habit itself had quietly become the point, separate from whatever it was supposed to produce. By month 5, something shifted. Not the numbers first, his relationship to them. He stopped flinching when he opened his banking app. He started recognizing his own patterns. The payday spike, the late-month tightening, the small purchases that had quietly bled him for years without ever once feeling like a decision he'd actually made. That recognition alone was worth more than the money. Though the money by then had started arriving too. By month 12, Hiroshi had saved more than he had in the previous 4 years combined. Not because he earned more, because he finally saw what he had always been earning and where exactly it had been leaking out the whole time. He thought, for a while, that this was the end of the story. A tidier person, a fuller savings account, a problem solved. He didn't yet understand that Kakeibo had been quietly teaching him something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with a word he hadn't learned yet. There's a word in Japanese that doesn't translate cleanly into English. Mottainai. It's usually rendered as "what a waste," but that flattens it. The real weight of the word isn't in scarcity, and it isn't in guilt. It's closer to a kind of regret at disrespect. The quiet wrongness of letting something valuable go unused, unseen, unappreciated, when it deserved better than that. You feel it in the half-eaten meal scraped into the bin, in the notebook 3/4 empty, replaced for no reason. In an afternoon spent scrolling through other people's lives instead of living your own. Mottainai isn't about hoarding. It's about noticing value before it disappears, because once it's gone, noticing it does nothing at all. Kakeibo, Hiroshi came to realize, was mottainai applied to money. Every unnoticed yen that left his account without his attention hadn't been spent badly, exactly. It had been wasted, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he never got to choose it. It simply happened, the way weather happens, without his consent or his awareness. This is the part that surprised him most. He had expected the notebook to make him anxious about money. One more system to obsess over. One more score to keep. It did the opposite. For the first time in 19 years, money stopped being something that happened to him. It became something he participated in. That distinction sounds small when you say it out loud. It didn't feel small. It felt like the difference between being a passenger in your own life and finally, quietly, taking the wheel. The real transformation was never the number in his savings account, though there was more there now, more than there had ever been. The transformation was something you couldn't graph, a kind of stillness, the specific, unglamorous confidence of a man who finally knew, in detail, where every part of his life was going. He hadn't gotten richer by accident. He had gotten attentive on purpose, and the richness had followed behind it, the way it usually does, quietly, and later than he expected. There was still one more piece of the story left, not about money at all, but about what to do with what he'd learned. Hiroshi's story isn't extraordinary. That's exactly why it matters. He didn't get a better job. He didn't win anything. He didn't stumble onto some secret only the wealthy are let in on. He picked up a pencil and he started paying attention. If you want to try this yourself, here's where to start. Not with a system, not with an app. For the next 7 days, write down every single expense by hand, no matter how small it feels to bother writing. Don't categorize it yet. Don't judge it. Just notice it. At the end of the week, ask yourself the one question Kakeibo has been asking for over a century. Which of these purchases actually made your life better? You already know the answer to at least one of them. The one you'd rather not write down. Tell me in the comments which one it is. And if you want to write your own vow this week, here's the one this method has carried for generations. I master my money. It does not master me. Remember the two men in the rain. Wealth was never about how much you earn. It's about how well you keep what falls. Next time, we'll look at the second half of this method, the 1% rule that, over a decade, doesn't just save money, it rebuilds a life. This is the quiet archetype.